Our third speaker is Anita Fábos, who's speaking about mapping Sudanese family values.
Thank you so much. First, I'd really like to thank the organizing committee for this extremely thoughtful program, and to the folks at CCAS for doing such a wonderful job in helping us settle in and organizing us and so forth. I'd like to start today with a story, and maybe I could use Lamis Abdelati's term puzzle to sort of get you to think with me about the characteristics of some Sudanese families in the diaspora, which really got me thinking about a different way of looking at Sudanese, not just family values and propriety and morality in the diaspora, but how they were strategizing through geographic space. And this is a story of somebody that I'll call Mohammed, and he was a Sudanese, or he still is a Sudanese refugee man in Brighton, UK. He was a member of Sudan's dominant Muslim Arab professional class. He claimed asylum in the UK in 1993, along with many other Sudanese. And after he developed his residence, he was able to call for his wife and 4 children through family reunification programs, and that was in the late 1990s. And what he started seeing and what the family started experiencing was a growing family tension and a deterioration of the marital relationship. And part of this will be familiar to those of you who study resettled families or migrant families having to cope with not just economic tension, but family gender norms were different, children and generational respect was different. And so he described to me that his wife was talking back to him, nagging him, that's the word that he used, instructing him on his responsibilities, sending money to her uncle without his permission. So family money was going to places that he had no control over. He was also concerned about the behavior of his children, that the girls were not behaving properly, and he had specific explanations of what not behaving properly was, and it had to do with comportment and clothing and contact with young men. So then his wife, with help from the Child Benefit Office in the UK, actually moved out and took her own place with the help of British the welfare benefits, and there was talk of divorce. So far, so common, I think. Refugees, families all over the place experience stress as family values from home come into conflict with local practices in receiving societies. But what followed, I think, was the puzzle that I alluded to earlier, and it's not necessarily well addressed in the literature on conflicted family relations in forced migration and diaspora. That was that Mohammed and his family decided that it was best for everyone if she moved with the children to Cairo, not back home. So we heard from Louise Kankar yesterday this extraordinary actually picture of dozens of schools across the Arab world that cater to children of Arab Americans, Arab Canadians, Arab British, who want to send their children back to the homeland to learn cultural values, to be infused with some of the religious expectations and so on. But Mohammed and Mohammed's family, his wife and children, were not moving back home to Sudan. He was still a refugee, had difficulties going back to Sudan. But he felt, and she, I guess, agreed that the children would have more proper values, and he would be able to visit, and his wife would be somehow in a respectable environment, and so on. So this anecdote, for me, presented a number of research questions that have to do both with this idea of propriety in the diaspora, but also, I did learn of other families in the end who were taking similar strategies, choosing to settle some members in Muslim countries rather than sending them home to Sudan. And I wanted to see if there were any generalizable conclusions that I could draw from this. Second, I wanted to understand what this meant for Western immigration policy assumptions that forced migrants were seeking asylum as a means to achieve residence in the West. So that's often the discourse, especially in Europe, that people are just coming to the West for a better life, and that's what they want. They want to settle there and become citizens. And third, how to cope with a number of methodological complexities in collecting reliable data. For example, how do we disaggregate one ethno-religious category of Sudanese, these Muslim Arab Sudanese, from the whole of Sudanese migration? How do we locate and see families whose members were not straightforward emigres, nor engaged in circular migration, nor based only in one locale? And how to accommodate the range of bureaucratic labels that also were alluded to quite a lot yesterday: refugees, forced migrants, labor migrants, etc. My research is thus exploring new ways of mapping mobility and I guess morality, and considering the meaning of being Muslim Arab Sudanese in relation to other supranational identities, such as religion, but others as well, but in the context of national asylum and immigration policy. So the state is still very significant in my understanding of what's going on. It does not disappearing. And it's starting to ask questions about whether the assumptions that migration decisions are based on a desire to achieve economic stability and or citizenship. We are currently witnessing the transformation of Sudan following the February 2011 referendum. So this is another really significant thing that's going on for Sudanese in the diaspora. Sudanese recognize that the already ambiguous Sudanese identity is in flux as they reconsider the new shape of their homeland, right? So the idea of Sudan is also dramatically transforming people's homeland expectations and understanding in the diaspora. Research about Muslim Arab Sudanese identity in the diaspora needs thus to be understood as not only shaped by specific local experiences, but highly contingent upon interactions with umbrella identities, such as being an Arab and being a Muslim in the diaspora. Okay, so I have a quick sort of three main points to make, or four main talking points. My research really highlights two sets of tensions, one which I'm going to speak more about today than the other. And these tensions are between the tension between national space, which I spoke about, and spiritual space, this idea of an Islamic geography. And another tension between Sudanese family morality, sort of ethnic ideas about what it means to be Sudanese, Muslim Arab Sudanese, and being in a diaspora that's very much overlapping with a sort of Muslim diaspora and thinking about Islam in diaspora. And I'll speak first a little bit about the history of Muslim Arab Sudanese and their movements in history and more recently. Then I'll lay out this argument that I'm trying to make, trying to understand where to locate diasporas between national space and other sorts of ways of thinking about movement and what's significant and what shapes movement. Third, I will describe something, some more definitions and findings about moral values in al-ghurba, the way that Sudanese refer to the diaspora. And finally, I'll just make some concluding remarks. Okay. This project builds on earlier research that I conducted in Cairo with Muslim Arab Sudanese in the late 90s and early 2000s, and in the UK in 2007, 2008. And overall, I think as an anthropologist, I'm really very interested in the changing identity of Sudanese overall. In Egypt, this change took the form of an anxiety and nervousness between the official Egyptian discourse of brotherhood between Egyptians and Sudanese. And at the same time, there was a state refugee policy clamping down, as Lamis described earlier today, on Sudanese ability to reside, work, have education in Egypt. The morality discourse that I discovered was actually, it seemed to me, it centered around a shared value that Sudanese had in common, not just with Egyptians, but with other Muslims in the diaspora. And that idea is the idea of adab, long historical discursive expression through in Arab writing and thinking. And my claim in that study was that this idea of adab, which was shared with Egyptians, was both an inclusive and a kind of an exclusive identity marker for Sudanese living in Egypt that didn't rock the boat too much. More recently, I've been exploring issues of Sudanese identity and belonging in the UK, particularly as Muslim Arab elites resist, ascribe minority and especially racial identities. And so this has been resulting in some research or some writing that I've been doing on blackness and using whiteness ideas of whiteness to try to understand how Sudanese Muslim Arabs are thinking of themselves in relation to ascribed racial categories outside of the Arab world. Currently, I'm still in the first phase of my new research project, which I am calling Mapping the Sudanese Diaspora. And to sort of explain where I'm coming from, so many of us, I think, in migration studies or refugee studies have come to an uneasy realization that locally, nationally, and regionally produced figures, numbers, patterns, and characteristics of mobile people are pale and static representations of what we actually see on the ground. We know that there must be more complexity and nuance to the migration statistics that are currently collected, and I heard a lot of you saying, well, you know, the range, for example, the range of Sudanese in Saudi Arabia is from 340,000 to 875,000, so, you know, very big range of people. So one of my tasks in this project is to try to clarify the parameters of a dispersed, highly mobile, yet connected group of people by making use of advances in social theory network and network theory and analysis. Nevertheless, we know very well that social networks do not exist without reference to physical territories and the current border regimes that shape movement. This attempt to see both the networks of Sudanese family members and track the immigration processes and entry and residence requirements allows me to recover or re-envision, I guess, the sorts of spaces and systems of mobility that, for example, Thomas McDowell was describing yesterday in terms of the historic patterns in the Indian Ocean. My aim today is to present the rethinking that I have had to engage with, to see Muslim Arab Sudanese patterns of movement with this degree of complexity, and to describe how one might devise a sample of research participants who represent the intersection of local, global value making for Sudanese families in the diaspora. So I've set myself an actually huge task. And I confess that as an ethnographer, I am straying quite a ways away from my own comfort zone. All right. The Sudanese in my study who are incompletely labeled, or labels are always problematic, right, in all of our research. And in the days before Sudanese statehood, there wasn't a Sudan to speak of, and the Sudanese identity was actually more of a identity given to Sudanese slaves. So Muslim Arab traders living in northern Sudan would not have seen themselves as Sudanese, but as part of trading families and trading tribes or settled tribes along the Nile Valley in north of Sudan. And they were involved in trade and trade routes. But Muslim Arabs from that region, as from other regions, were also involved in spiritual travel, right? So they would have known the key places in the constellation of Islamic theology. They would have known or have gone on Hajj or Umrah, and they would have been familiar with the concept of rihla, traveling for education and spiritual enlightenment. But also, Sudanese were involved in other sorts of patterns of movement, including as warriors. Zubair Basha was a slave trader originally from northern Sudan, who was actually given the role of governor of Sudan by Muhammad Ali, but then was exiled I guess he was under some sort of house arrest in Egypt as the British tried to stop the slave trade in Sudan. And then we also know from the work of Rogaya Abu Sharaf that Sudanese joined merchant marine services and were a small number of them settled in different parts of the world, including New York. So there's a population of, quite sort of like fourth generation or third and fourth generation of Sudanese merchant marine families in New York. In the more contemporary era, we see that a lot of the work on Sudanese migration focuses on what's been called labor migration, largely to and from Arab Gulf countries, and in particular for Sudanese, Saudi Arabia. But we also, I think most of us are familiar with the history, of Sudanese conflict, and we have invasion and expulsion of Sudanese from after the 1989 military coup, and in post-invasion expulsion of Sudanese from Kuwait. I'm not sure how many of you know about the 100,000 or so Sudanese who were expelled from Kuwait after the Gulf War. And there have been forced migrations from these processes to various cities in neighboring countries, including Cairo, Asmara, Benghazi, Manama, and finally settlement to the west through asylum and lottery processes and family reunification now more contemporarily. Okay, so I have a couple of slides that try to get us thinking about different ways to envision space. And I've described Sudanese mobility across time and space. The relatively recent introduction of contemporary border regimes makes us think that maybe mobility looked different to people in previous eras. Refugee and immigrant movements are often studied in relation to barriers and options that shape patterns of exit and entry, but my research is additionally concerned with how the spiritual geography of Islam influences Sudanese choices. Edward Said observed that nation building in the 20th century produced an era of mass forced migration. And I think Lisa Malky's work recently on nations and refugees has also helped us to understand how whole groups of people can be out of place. We've heard a lot about that in our previous panel, in the national order of things, so people who don't fit into one state or the other. And much of refugee and immigration policy is designed to manage people who are out of place through repatriating them, incorporating them, or resettling them in other countries. The idea of methodological nationalism, which is something that migration studies, even migration studies, which is the studies of people moving, has been accused of. The idea that migrants go to and from countries and are viewed solely as moving from one sort of container to another. And I think most of us in our work recognize that that doesn't necessarily capture what's actually going on. However, that's how statistics are collected. We collect national statistics. IOM just produced a report in 2011 on migration to and from Sudan, which is very much about crossing national borders, number of work visas issued by Saudi Arabia, numbers of Sudanese born who take Canadian citizenship, and so on and so forth, so very nationally oriented. However, no national statistics can account for the significant number of Sudanese whose place of birth and or nationality is not Sudan, such as those born in Kuwait before 1990 and who were expelled with their families to Cairo, from whence they may have claimed asylum and naturalized in the US, Holland, Canada, or a number of other places where the Sudanese have resettled. NORCAN statistics describe entry and exit across borders. NORCAN statistics that describe entry and exit across borders account for the mobility of Sudanese. For example, a number of my research participants who live in Europe spend months at a time in Cairo, Dubai, even Khartoum, while older Sudanese women and men spend months visiting their married children in different places of the diaspora. So this movement and this kind of connectivity and sort of mobility is not captured by our statistical data. Even the idea of transnationalism is tied to the idea of nations as containers, and it's very difficult, therefore, to see alternative geographies. So, nevertheless, there are alternative frameworks that have meaning and shape the choices of these quite mobile Muslim Arab Sudanese. And the story that I only recently reinterpreted for myself was in Egypt, when I worked with Sudanese, many of them were finding work opportunities in the Gulf, but others were being able to seek refuge or claim asylum and be resettled in Western countries. And we had these hafalat al-wada, these goodbye parties that were sort of send-offs and, wish you well, and people would gather and say goodbye to their friends. And I started noticing, or I noticed, sort of rethinking my data, that these hafalat al-wada were not done when people were leaving to Bahrain or Saudi Arabia or back to Khartoum. So they weren't really about saying goodbye. How I'm now thinking about it is that they were about crossing into or out of Muslim space and into some other kind of unknown. Thank you so much. Is that the 15 time or the 20-minute time?
It's the 20 minutes.
Oh, is it? Okay, no worries.
You can have an extra minute because you asked.
That's so nice. Okay, so this theological debate among Muslims over whether Dar al-Islam is limited to states where religion is Islam or whether it extends to include Muslims wherever they may be is quite interesting. But in thinking of Muslim Sudanese residing in places while connecting with Muslims in other places gives us quite a different understanding of Islamic space than counting numbers of Muslims in a national territory. So my methodological inquiry into Sudanese identity in the diaspora focuses on family networks across national borders to explore how the moral geography of Islam shapes migration patterns. So I see you looking at this map. It's not very clear here, but it's a weighted map of Muslim people who claim their identity as Muslim, and that's what the world looks like if we think about where Muslims live. So my final point that I'd like to make today is about morality and moral values in this idea of al-ghurba. I want to call your attention to the Sudanese descriptions of the term al-ghurba, or as I said, it translates loosely into the diaspora. The Arabic word for west, gharb, has the same root as the word for strange, gharib. In the poignant opening to her chapter, Finding Refuge in the Shrine of Culture, the Sudanese anthropologist Rogaya Abu Sharaf discusses the concept of ghurba, life away from home, which she tells us means more than physical separation or even exile. It is worth quoting Abu Sharaf's analysis at length, as she is both a scholar of Sudanese experiences in diaspora and a member of that diaspora herself. And she says, for the Sudanese, the ghurba evokes loneliness, loss, uprootedness, nostalgia, yearning for the familiar. It refers to a psychological state as well, a sense of alienation one finds away from family and friends back home. To give a flavor of the depth of the term in the Sudanese psyche and consciousness, a Sudanese will say, Allah yarud ghurbatu, may God reverse the alienation, on two occasions, to wish someone a safe return home or to wish someone a speedy recovery from any form of psychological stress. The physical state of being distant from one's home and the psychological state of mental pressure are equated, says Abu Sharaf. The Sudanese anthropologist Manzul Asal similarly notes the importance of the concept of ghurba in the Norwegian context, and I'm bringing this to a close with a comment about morality in Islam. Additionally, Asal makes the important point that the term first gained broad contemporary usage in reference to Sudanese migrants in the Gulf countries, mughtaribin, a term that Asal translates as expatriates. Currently, he explains, the Sudanese term mughtaribin includes all types of migrants, including refugees, and assesses its importance to Sudanese refugees pursuing homemaking activities in Norway. But homemaking was additionally strongly connected with pursuing particular types of values, which Asal finds in linguistic, religious, and behavioral practices. These values are very much linked to a transnational Islamic discourse of propriety articulated and debated by a vocal segment of Muslim society across Europe. If Sudanese refugees feel that on an important socio-cultural level they are connected to a transnational Islamic ummah by living in Muslim societies, then the ideal of national belonging as the sole reserve of achieving citizenship needs to be explored from a different perspective. To conclude then, Muslim Arab Sudanese patterns of settlement and movement, like those of many diasporas, are shaped by the border requirements and integration policies of the states in which they reside. However, I propose that Sudanese mobility, as well as identity in the diaspora, needs also to be considered in terms of spiritual borders and belonging. By revisioning the Sudanese diaspora as a mobile network of people across both national and spiritual space, I'm hoping to get a better understanding of both local and diasporic belonging. Thank you.